This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is one of the most significant organizations in the United States for the study and research of African American life and culture. Khalil Muhammad, professor of history at Indiana University, will take leadership of the Schomburg in July of 2011. Professor Muhammad joins us this afternoon on Left of Black, and we're also joined by Professor Ben Carrington, sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin, who will talk about his new book, Race, Sports, and Politics, The Black Sporting Diaspora. You're watching Left of Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Good afternoon, you're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by a special guest, Professor Khalil Muhammad, Assistant Professor of History at Indiana University, or the University of Indiana, is that?
It's Indiana University.
Indiana University. He is also the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, and perhaps most famously these days, starting July of 2011, he will be the new director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. How are you doing today, Khalil?
I'm great. Thanks so much, Mark, for having me on the show.
Well, let me start by just saying congratulations. You, like me, probably know 12 or 15 other people who at some point got contacted about their interest in being the new director of the Schomburg. And so I think many of us are very happy with the choice that's been made, very satisfied with the choice that's been made. So, just first off, congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's one of those processes that lasted a long time, and a lot of people were involved. I'm not completely aware of all the candidates. I've heard from a few people who said they got the very phone call that you described, and they were either invited to consider the process themselves or to weigh in on who some of the candidates were. So I'm certainly thankful. As my mother told me a long time ago, don't burn any bridges. And in this case, I think that advice paid off.
The current director, Howard Dodson, has been doing fabulous work there. I think many people think of the Schomburg in 2010 as very much a part of the Harlem community, part of an institution in the Harlem community. And of course, that created, once he announced his decision to retire, there was a lot of chatter, in the blogosphere, Twitter, New York Times, a range of folks, wondering what the future of the Schomburg was going to be. There were initial rumors that the collection was going to be moved someplace else. Folks saw that Skip Gates was attached to the search committee, and folks started to get alarmed about the direction of it. What were your thoughts about the Schomburg, going forward? Even as you've probably spent time in the collections there, what have your thoughts been about the Schomburg in the past?
Well, when I used the Schomburg years ago as a graduate student at Rutgers, I approached the Schomburg as a unique archive, a treasure trove of materials related to the Black experience in the United States and in the world. And in that regard, the time that I spent there was precious. It was very important to the story that I was telling in the book. And so I had as productive experience as a researcher there, someone with no plan, in a sense of becoming a director. I mean, my head was literally in the folders of dusty boxes at the time. So one, to answer your question, I had a very positive experience. And two, on the receiving end of news of Howard Dodson's retirement, I also, as a researcher, wanted to, in a sense, I had an investment like everyone else in making sure that leadership changed hands smoothly and that those precious assets would be cared for properly.
I mean, you mentioned, the kind of work that we do as academics. I mean, the idea of the Schomburg means something very specific. A place for us to go to do the kind of hardcore research that makes us who we are. The Schomburg means something very different, for a vast majority of people who are not academics. You mentioned in your interview with the New York Times, Felicia Lee, this idea of using the Schomburg as a kind of bully pulpit, for Black history in American society. Could you expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think that we live in a time of the diminishing relevancy for the humanities in general.
Yeah.
This takes the form of budgets being cut at the university level, privileging the sciences and technology here at IU. It's clear that life sciences are the future of this university's fundraising and the kind of support that it thinks that it needs to cultivate.
And that's not very different than it is here at Duke. So, we're seeing a national trend, yeah.
That's right. So in the biggest, or I think in the most important, broadest context, I'm concerned about the future of the humanities in general. Now, more specifically, I think in the wake of Obama's campaign, not simply the election, but President Obama's campaign itself, I think it became clear to me that the public conversation on race was moving backwards, not forwards. Yeah. And I think the gap separating what we talk about in academic spaces as either critical ethnic studies people or as people tied to the traditional disciplines, I think the level of conversation that we can engage in at universities doesn't come anywhere close to the paucity of nuance, richness, truth-telling. It's just, to me, the landscape of public discourse is in awful shape. And when I think about the Schomburg, it's hard not for me to think about it in relation to the issues of public policy, the issues of sort of challenging mythologies that exist in conversation, the essentialisms that still pass as common sense in everyday chatter. And so I see the Schomburg having a place in the future for deploying some academic sanity back into the conversation, so to speak.
You're 38 years old, so you probably grew up in Chicago, probably have very vivid memories of the first time you heard hip hop. Probably grew up as a hip hop head, as many of us did. How do we go forward and make a space like the Schomburg relevant, to the so-called hip hop generation?
That's an interesting question. It's one that I will be asking people like yourself and so many, Imani Perry and William Cobb and others to really help me to figure out how to reach out. Bakari Kitwana came here and spoke a couple of years ago to our black students, and he and I talked a little bit afterwards about the challenges and sort of getting students to make, and young people in general, to make the link between critical knowledge, empowerment, and the arts. I mean, they have the arts, and they have a little bit of the empowerment, but the critical knowledge part of it is often the hard part that I often see my students struggling with. The sense of why do we need to do that kind of work. I'll give you an example by way of anecdote. I was teaching a class on urban history. This is a stock course for me. An African-American student got frustrated within maybe the second or third class and said, well, when are we going to get to New York and Chicago in the 1980s and the war on drugs and Reagan? And here we are talking about trolley cars in the 1850s and 1860s. But the point is that that's part of the story.
Right.
Because the recreation of what cities look like matter to the lived realities of people who live in those cities. And there was just kind of an impatience with him in particular. He actually dropped the class, but we've become friends ever since then. And he has his regrets. I wish I could have kept him in there. But to me, that's the challenge that we have as scholars in this generation, is making what we do relevant to young people. Yeah. That burden is our burden to bear, because we don't have the Bull Connors with their fire hoses. Yeah. We don't have the young civil rights activists and black power activists of the 60s and 70s whose actual lived experiences taught them all the history they needed to know. Now, don't get me wrong, with stop and frisk in New York City, with any number of contemporary social challenges that young people face, they recognize that there's still work to be done, but I'm not sure that those history lessons are as informative today as they used to be.
Let me ask this question. I got a big chuckle reading your interview with TheRoot.com, and this question. I mean, there's always this kind of concern, I think, particularly amongst this generation of black intellectuals, that somehow we don't have our feet in the communities that we live. And I remember the interviewer made a big point of asking you whether or not you would be part of the Harlem community, and you kind of responded, "I'll definitely be around. I won't be Skyping into community meetings." What role do you think, thinking about Skype and Twitter and Facebook and social media, I mean, what role do you think that social media can play in making the Schomburg a much more accessible space, not just for young folks, but for a broader range of folks outside of the Black community?
Well, Mark, this is an easy question, right? So here we are on Skype having a conversation, right? So technology makes things possible. The issue here is not to jettison the technology, but to deploy it in thoughtful and effective ways.
Right.
So in whatever inexpensive, effective ways, I can use Skype, I can use webcasts, I can use the power of the internet to harness the amazing work that people are doing around the country in the way that you are doing right now is all for the good. I mean, there's no question about that. Whether that reaches young people or people who are infirmed in elderly homes, they still count too. I mean, my parents are not quite there yet, but my grandparents are. And consequently, if I want to reconnect them to the work that the Schomburg is happening, it's going to require a MacBook and an internet and Wi-Fi. So I am wide open to using as much technology as possible in order to increase access to the Schomburg, because at the end of the day, the reason for focusing on young people is really to create stakeholders for the future.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to be there forever. I will pass from this earth. And the point is that we need to leave the Schomburg in our community and have a community of stakeholders who are as passionate about history and about Black folks in general as we are. I mean, this passion doesn't come by osmosis. The passion for history and for the voices of our ancestors can come out of lived experience, but it also comes out of what stories we have been told and the knowledge that we've been exposed to. And so if we're not doing our part as 40-somethings and 30-somethings to spread the word, to share that knowledge with others, then we run the risk of a future that will look bleaker than the one that we already have.
Even before, and you're watching Left of Black, I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Dr. Khalil Muhammad, new director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, starting July 2011. Even before, folks talked about you taking over the Schomburg, there was a lot of chatter about you because of this wonderful big book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern America. Can you talk a little bit about the book and what you were trying to achieve? I mean, you make a very credible argument, really sophisticated argument about the links, historical links between Blackness and criminality, in American society.
I think that the real thrust of the book is an attempt to open up a conversation that I've been party to, that I know you've written about in The New Black Man. It's a conversation that seems to just go in an unending circle. Mm-hmm. And it's a conversation that starts with the premise that Black people are pathological, and it ends with Black people are pathological. And part of what the book attempts to do is to look at a moment where those basic assumptions are not tied explicitly to criminality. They're tied to age-old notions of African savagery. They're tied to questions of biological inferiority, but they're not quite linked to this crime thing. And in a sense, the thrust of the book is to detach the racial argument of crime and put it back where it squarely belongs, which is in a social context. Which is to say, Black people have no monopoly on any form of pathology in this country or anywhere else in the world. And so to begin to actually talk about the origins, the causes, the solutions, we first have to understand how we got into this conversation in the first place, which was a project of white supremacy. It was a project of actually trying to limit and roll back the freedoms that Black people earned and gained in the postbellum period. So that means drawing in the story of European immigration. It means talking about the urban North and not the South. The South was and continues to be the great American boogeyman for racism. And in fact, the postmodern story, if we are even in a postmodern age, but the postmodern story of racism in America is one that really is not very Southern. if anything, is national, and more specifically, is urban.
We're here on Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're talking with Dr. Khalil Muhammad, the new director of the Schomburg Center for Black Research and Black Culture, and the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. One of the questions, and this is very much my kind of question, thinking about the trajectory of your career, you've just published this great book, clearly on a trajectory, a certain kind of trajectory within the academy. Why choose at this point, relatively early in your career, to kind of give up on the tenure track gig to run the Schomburg? I'm not sure a lot of your peers or our peers would have made that kind of decision at this stage in their career.
This first of all, it's not an easy decision in terms of what we are groomed to become once we enter graduate school. Once we enter graduate school, the incentives for publishing success, for name recognition in your field, are all moving in one direction, which is the academy. Now, that being said, over the course of my time here at Indiana University, and particularly over the time of finishing the book, I have increasingly wanted to what I call translate this work for wider audiences, to bring it to people who don't know it and could find something about the story that could be empowering for them. I can't control how people will interpret the work, but I can certainly share with them why I think it matters. And the simple fact of conveying that information to me is as important as anything I do on this campus. So on one hand, having the opportunity to educate college students is critical work. It's the groundwork for future generations of activists, of artists, of people who will celebrate, their glorious individuality. But on another hand, the university is a kind of secluded, set-aside place. And I've struggled in this capacity with finding appropriate and relevant and effective outlets for engaging people on a subject that I think everyone needs to take ownership of and to be engaged with. And the Schomburg is a once-in-a-life opportunity, and no one, given the history of the number of directors that I believe the number's 5 over the course of its 85-year history, you can't plan to become the director of the Schomburg. and so when the opportunity presented itself, I took it very seriously and embraced it, and now I'm just extremely enthusiastic about it now that I actually have the chance to do the work.
You have a significant family legacy. Your father, of course, is an award-winning photographer for the New York Times. Your great-grandfather, of course, is the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. What do you think your great-grandfather would say, if he could see his great-grandson now, doing the great scholarly work he's done and preparing to take over this wonderful and important Black institution? What would he say?
You caught me with a question I haven't yet heard. So, good for you. I think, well, first of all, he was a man who was fundamentally committed to the project of seeing history as a tool of self-empowerment.
Absolutely.
So knowledge of self was probably more than anything else a core principle of the Nation of Islam. And the Schomburg Center itself, representing the premier institution for knowledge of Black people, is by itself a testament to the legacy that he left behind in Black communities across this country, and particularly for me. So I didn't live long enough to know what his, what he would say to his great-grandchildren when he said, "Good job," or "I'm proud of you." But I certainly think that he'd be proud of me, and he'd let me know that in whatever way he customarily did.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined this afternoon by Dr. Khalil Muhammad, Professor of History at Indiana University, also the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, and also, starting July 2011, the new director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Thanks for joining us, Khalil.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Mark.
Take care.
Take care. I'm
Mark Anthony Neal, and we're back here on Left of Black. We are joined now by Professor Ben Carrington, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of the brand new book, Race, Sport, and Politics, The Sporting Black Diaspora. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good also. And let me first congratulate you on a fantastic book. Really, I think, pushes the conversation around race and blackness, obviously, but also masculinity, I think, in very interesting and significant ways. One of the things that you kind of frame the book with is this notion that sport is really an undervalued arena, for the making and unmaking of race. Could you talk a little bit about that, in that context?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of things there. I mean, the first, I've been frustrated for a while, for many years now, with the lack of attention, really, that sport is given within critical black studies. Which is surprising in some ways, given the prominence and dominance of sport within black popular culture and within the society at large. And there's tended to be, I think, for understandable reasons, an over-focus on other parts of black popular culture. So music being the key domains in which we've produced a number of critical works over the years, and rightfully so. And sport tends to kind of get marginalized to a degree. So even when you read the works of critical theorists on black culture, and black popular culture in particular, when sport is invoked, it tends to be a passing reference to O.J. Simpson or Michael Jordan. Maybe a paragraph at best, normally a footnote. If you can get a whole page, you're doing quite well. And then people get back to the more serious analysis of Kanye West, and whoever is dominating the popular musical scene. So part of the book really is to kind of make an intervention into that, to say that we need to kind of take sport itself more seriously, and to kind of think about the ways in which we can begin to theorize the physicality of sport, the aesthetics of sport, and primarily the politics of sport. So part of that, therefore, to more directly address your question, is not just to think about the ways in which racism impacts sport. Most of us kind of, especially in the US with the history of segregation of American sports, can think of numerous examples, and there's been good historical work looking at the extent to which American sports were primarily white spaces, white male spaces. And in the European context, for example, we can think about the extent to which overt forms of racism are still very prevalent within soccer, professional soccer in Europe. So, that's one way to think about these relationships, the extent to which racism impacts sport. But one of the things I try to do in the book is to make an argument that actually sport has an impact into race relations more generally, or at least racial discourse more generally. So to think about sport as actually being a kind of an active social institution and cultural practice that reshapes our broader understandings of race outside of the sporting domain. So I think that's one of the kind of the bigger claims and arguments that I try to make in the book.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Ben Carrington, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, author of the new book, Race, Sport, and Politics, The Sporting Black Diaspora. December 26, 1908. That's the date that you choose to describe the beginning or the invention of the black athlete. And of course, you're talking about the great black heavyweight Jack Johnson. Talk about this invention. What is it about Jack Johnson in this particular moment that helps create this idea, this cultural resonance for what we think of as the black athlete?
Yeah, it's one of the things that's intrigued me for a while. When I speak to my students, I'm sure the same is true for yourself, and you begin to kind of debunk myths and stereotypes about blackness and black identity and racial difference, and you make critiques of, say, the notion that blacks are less intelligent than whites. Most people buy into that. Most people kind of support that argument. It kind of resonates at a certain level. People find it problematic to think that blacks are inherently less intelligent than whites. So there's a kind of an ethical disposition which opens it up to the kind of academic critiques we can make of certain types of racial science. Similarly, relation to criminality, although there's notions that black people may be more prone to engage in criminal activity, for the most part, those types of right-wing discourses have been discredited. So you can make those arguments. But when it comes to sports, students don't always buy the argument, and often black students as well. So there's still a notion that there is something in the kind of black genome that predisposes black people to jump, to run fast, to throw a ball, etc., etc. And what's interesting is that this is actually quite a new phenomenon, this notion of black physical superiority. Yeah. So one of the things I was interested in reading some of the early literature on kind of racial difference and racial science was the fact that although today we have this assumption of black physical superiority, and it's very widespread in terms of people's popular perceptions of race and racial difference.
White men can't jump, right? You know, as a popular adage goes, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can list all those popular tropes. So the notion that white men can't jump, that white men lack the ability to leave the ground with any great success compared to blacks, is deeply ingrained in the popular imagination at this point, within the West in general. So one of the things that kind of intrigued me was the fact that that wasn't the case in the 18th and 19th century. In fact, the reverse was the case. There was a notion of white physical supremacy. So kind of white supremacy operated, I argue, on these kind of three core principles. So one was the notion that whites were more intelligent than blacks. The second was that whites were aesthetically more pleasing than blacks. So the black African form was a grotesque kind of distortion of the true epitome of human beauty. And third, that whites were physically superior to blacks. When you come to the midpoint in the 20th century, that discourse has changed. That discourse has been forever altered. And so I became interested in, okay, what's the pivotal point, or how does this 19th century racial schema, which is very dominant, suddenly by the mid-20th century, or at least one part of it, that third part about white physical supremacy, how and why does that get disrupted? And so I made the argument that, as you point out, that Jack Johnson becomes a pivotal figure in disrupting that particular aspect of racial discourse and that particular racial logic. So in 1908, in December the 26th, in Sydney, Australia, Jack Johnson beats the white Canadian Tommy Burns to become the first black heavyweight champion of the world. And there's something important about the heavyweight championship because it seemed to embody the kind of pinnacle of heterosexual manhood. It's about strength, aggression, violence, bravery, all the things that were attributed to white people. And so it's imagine the context in 1908 in the West in general and the US in particular, to have a black man holding the title of supreme masculine identity. And this isn't a humble black man. This isn't a deferential black man. This isn't a yes massa black man. This is a black man who, at the beginning of the 20th century, is driving fast cars, wearing expensive clothes, dating white women publicly.
I mean, flaunting it, really. I mean, right?
Yeah. I say to my students, you think of O.J. Simpson times or Osama bin Laden, to the kind of public enemy status that Jack Johnson had at that particular point. And he was masterful in the ring. So as all of these white ex-champions came out of retirement to try to take back the mantle, and this is where we get that expression, actually, the Great White Hope. The Great White Hope is a term that's produced at that moment to try to reclaim the mantle of kind of masculine pride back from what they refer to as the giant Negro from Galveston, Texas. So I argue that Jack Johnson begins to disrupt this logic of white physical supremacy. Put simply, how can you claim physical supremacy over the Negroes when Jack Johnson, the Galveston-born black boxer, is the greatest heavyweight champion of the time? But one of the things that inadvertently is produced in that moment is what I refer to as the invention of the black athlete that you mentioned earlier. And so just as one kind of racial logic is disrupted, and eventually by the time you get to the 1930s with Jesse Owens in athletics and Joe Louis in boxing, the notion of physical supremacy is kind of hard to maintain. It's still there to a degree. You see it to a degree within the kind of 1936 Berlin Olympics and the discourses that still surround the notion of Aryan supremacy. But certainly by the time you get to the 1950s, the notion of whites being physically superior to blacks, particularly in the athletic domain, is completely given up. And I argue in a sense, therefore, that Jack Johnson creates this trope, this idea of the black athlete, which has a very powerful effect, not just in terms of the sports arena, but in changing popular understandings of race and racial difference more generally.
I mean, you mentioned, that what happens because of this shift, particularly throughout the 20th century, is that, this kind of hyper-commodified, commercialized sports arena. We could think about football in Britain or football here in the United States. It becomes this kind of space for these fantasies of white masculine domination that really don't fit outside of those purviews. But specifically within this hyper-commodified sports arena, I'm thinking about, again, American football and the singular presence of the white quarterback on the football field as being the epitome, right, of what masculinity and intellect and all these things represent in this particular sport, and how even someone like a Michael Vick challenges that on some levels, right, in ways that he literally has to be contained and even policed, criminalized, both on the field and beyond.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there are a few things there. So one is that once sports become desegregated in the 1940s and then through the 1950s and into the 1960s. So let me trace that back. So one of the things that happens when Jack Johnson finally is defeated in the ring is that the so-called colour line is drawn. So white's going to say, look, no, this hasn't worked out too well. Letting these Negroes, come and have, a few fights with us and they end up winning. It doesn't work out too well. So we're going to make the argument that whites are so obviously physically superior to blacks, so we don't even need to compete against them.
Yeah.
So Jack Johnson is an aberration. It was a mistake. It was a one-off. We're not going to let that happen again. So there was an increased forms of segregation and exclusion of blacks into sporting spaces that we see around the beginning of the 20th century. As part of the civil rights movement and as part of the broader process of the kind of breaking down of that type of Jim Crow racism and overt forms of racial exclusion, blacks slowly gain entry into sporting spaces, but what we still see are forms of what we might refer to as kind of positional segregation. So certain positions are seen to be kind of white positions. Yeah. And those positions are invariably those which are accorded greater cognitive responsibilities. And there's lots of literature within the sociology of sport that refers to this process of stacking. So stacking is a process whereby certain players from particular racial groups are stacked disproportionately in certain positions. So we see here the working out of racial discourse within sports. The notion is that black athletes are quick, they're strong, they're naturally athletic, but they can't really read the game. So you can put them as a wide receiver or running back.
Right.
And the central positions, which will really dictate the outcome of the game, which require cognitive skills, the ability to read the game, right, are reserved for white players, hence the quarterback. So for many years, therefore, you see this notion of people really kind of believing that a true quarterback who can read the game, can stay in the pocket, gets coded as white. And black quarterbacks are those that really, they're kind of running backs that just happen to be able to kind of throw the ball well as well. So you see this kind of racial discourse getting played out within the particular position as well. And it does set up a set of kind of criteria, I would suggest, by which players are kind of judged differently from other players. And I'd also say, the other thing you mentioned there was about thinking about sport as a space of desire. I think that's one of the things that's kind of overlooked. Yeah. There are very few spaces, public spaces, mass media spaces, in which we get to see people in states of undress. But sport is one of them. And so you have this interesting phenomena of, on the one hand, these sporting spaces being deemed to be kind of white preserves, in which blacks are sometimes kind of tokenistically allowed entry into these spaces with these kind of sets of conditions. So if you act in this way, if you behave in this way, if you show deference, then you can play our sports. And if you start acting up, you start being too cocky, right, you start speaking out, then the kind of spectre of Jack Johnson kind of comes back. But sports are also interesting spaces in which you have predominantly or largely white male audiences, spectators, fans, shouting for and desiring the physical movement and bodies of often largely black male athletes in various states of undress. Football's slightly different, at least American football. So there are some interesting dynamics there about projections of desire and longing and love and kind of homosocial aspects, certain taboos, which I think we need to kind of think more about.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Ben Carrington, sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin and the author of the new book, Race, Sport, and Politics, The Sporting Black Diaspora. And I'd like to take a little bit with that little tag, this idea of the sporting black diaspora, or the Black Atlantic diaspora, as you often also describe it within the book. And you're very clear that when you talk about sport being a space that's undervalued, that it also becomes an arena, if you will, a stage, for black communities to articulate notions of pride and cultural relevance, and even civil rights, right, as a way to articulate certain vehicles around civil rights and human rights. We know what that looks like, when we're talking about Jackie Robinson in 1947. We know what that looks like in Mexico City in 1968. I think we know what that looks like, among African nationals playing in European football leagues, in 2010. What does that look like in the United States, in 2010, this idea that sport be thought of as a place where blackness articulates a kind of critical sensibility?
Yeah, I'm not sure the extent to which it does. And part of the argument of the book really is to say that it should do, but perhaps that it doesn't. So you mention a number of iconic kind of moments and times when we really do see the coming together, the convergence of sports and politics in very clear ways. So 1968 Mexico Olympics, the John Smith, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, Black Power salute.
Right. And George Foreman performing an alternative to that, flag waving.
Exactly. Yeah. So we've always had that. So you have George Foreman when he wins his gold medal in the ring with his small star-spangled banner flag. So those things have always gone along. So you make a good point there. So we could read other moments of 1968 in the Mexico Olympics, and we tend to kind of perhaps elevate certain iconic, more overtly politicized, and what we might claim to be more progressive moments over others. But those contradictions of the potential for radicalism and conservatism, the potential to have sport be a mechanism and a kind of space for progressive politics and social transformation, as against sports being a space for regressive politics and social conservatism, have always been there. Those things are always kind of in battle. There's all that kind of dialectic that's playing out. And to come back to something you talked about earlier, but in relation to the kind of commodification and what I refer to as the hyper-commercialization of contemporary sports cultures, is that the financial and monetary pressures on many black athletes today means to a large extent they become good corporate spokesmen. And their progressive politics, which could be there, is either compromised or sublimated into a very generalized humanitarian discourse, which is a kind of which is often ends up being, basketball. You start to turn on any American network and not see the NFL or the NBA making some pronouncements about how they go into the community and help impoverished kids and we send some basketballs to Africa, etc., etc. So that type of easy humanitarianism is clearly endorsed by many athletes. But the more critical work of beginning to make some connections between capital, inequality, race, and the place of sports within that is very difficult. Some athletes do speak out, but they tend to be exceptional. And they often tend to speak out when their careers are coming to the end or they've retired.
When they're really marginal, right, to the various sports, They're
either marginal in the teams or they only develop that kind of critical consciousness towards the ends of their careers when they begin to think back, when they begin to break out of actually the very disciplining rhetoric that is logics that should require to become a professional athlete because of the hierarchies of which are often embedded within sports structures. Frantz Fanon has a really good line in The Wretched of the Earth where he kind of implores African politicians and leaders not to invest in athletes for its own sake, for their own sake, but has this good phrase where he says that what Africa needs, and I think we could generalize to the African diaspora, is not more sportsmen, sports people, but critical and conscious individuals who also practice sports.
Yeah.
I think it's that kind of distinction that is something that is often, I think, lacking in this particular historical period.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with University of Texas at Austin sociologist Ben Carrington. One of the last things I want to talk to you about, one of the references you make throughout the book is to Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, and the idea of the Battle Royale. And you spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the relationship between Iron Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno. On the one hand, this is a very interesting kind of Black Atlantic exchange between the British Bruno and the American Mike Tyson, but you talk about how this kind of tension between them itself becomes a commodifiable product.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things there. So one is, and I don't know how familiar Frank Bruno is to US audiences. Can you tell me, Mark? I mean, people know Mike Tyson, but when
I think they know, because of some of the comments that Tyson made about Bruno during the first fight, the things that he was going to do to his children and his wives. I think folks actually have pretty good memories. If they know of a British boxer, it's Frank Bruno. Yeah.
So I trace this relationship between Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno in one of the chapters, and my argument is the extent to which there's at least within the British media in particular, there was a construction of the good black versus the bad black.
Mm-hmm.
So our Frank, and he was often called our Frank, he became part of the British family, was seen to be the good black subject, the loyal subject. This was a way in which black British people could be shown a model of what it meant to be black and British if you acted like Frank Bruno. So Frank Bruno was very conservative. He spoke about his love of the royal family, Maggie Thatcher, as he called her. They endorsed a kind of notion that racism would disappear if we all just got along, and then the only people who produced racism were left-wing agitators who kept bringing up the race question. So he was, had a very problematic relationship to Black Britons, who saw him to a degree as having a kind of an apolitical persona and selling out in it. Right. Contrasted with Iron Mike Tyson, the nasty, snarling American, who will eat your babies and eat people's ears, etc. So he got constructed, very literally as well. So I don't just mean this metaphorically. He was labelled as a savage, an animal, a cannibal. All of those colonial tropes which used to define blackness were kind of projected onto Tyson. So you see here between kind of Tyson and Bruno, a kind of a centuries-long morality tale about what does it mean to be black in the West getting played out, and Tyson was therefore depicted as the kind of the antithesis of what it meant to be a civilized Western European subject, and Bruno was positioned as the acceptable face of black masculinity. But one of the things I also kind of argue in the book is that if you actually look at their post-career lives, they've actually kind of transformed themselves in quite interesting ways. Tyson, I would suggest now, is actually coming to, he's kind of reinvented himself to a degree. Not for everyone, and not without some contradictions. But I think the James Toback documentary Tyson, which if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth seeing. It's some interesting moments in that film where Tyson, in his last fight, when Tyson finally retires, he says something to the effect of, "I'm tired of being Mike Tyson. I can't keep playing this character called Mike Tyson. I can't do it anymore." And I think one of the things that I read in that moment is that what Tyson is effectively saying is, I can't play the black athlete anymore. I can't play this aggressive, animalistic, force of black negritude, which is just this kind of dominating form of black physicality, because it's a charade. It's something. It's a myth. It's a role that many young black men have to play if they're going to be accepted. And
not nearly as lucrative for Mike Tyson as it was, 15 years ago.
So you can earn a lot of money by playing that type of role. And Tyson says, I can't do this anymore. And I think it's that moment when he's actually lost. It's that moment of kind of humility that gets produced from the space of failure. When he fails to be that domineering, violent construction of black masculinity, and walks away from it. And he says, as Roberto Duran once famously said, like, no mass, no mass. This is it. So I read that as actually been a really important moment in terms of beginning to produce what you and others have referred to as more progressive forms of black masculinity, alternative black masculinities. And then there's the famous Oprah Winfrey show from last year, 2009, when Tyson was on Oprah for 2 shows. Yeah. And on one of them, he actually met Evander Holyfield, the person, of course, bitten the ear off.
Yeah.
off. So Holyfield and Tyson meet. They always had a strange relationship. And Tyson embraces Holyfield. He apologizes for his actions. He shows humility. He shows deference. He talks in very warm and glowing ways about just being happy to be associated with Holyfield. And he says something at the end that's very important. He says simply, we need to treat each other better. We need to love each other more. And he puts his hand gently on top of Holyfield's. Now, I'm always accused of overreading moments, but I think that's interesting. If you think about Tyson as the kind of pinnacle of a type of hyper-violent black masculinity, then articulating notions of love, friendship, warmth, and intimacy as well, amongst other black men, and not just any black men, but amongst those very same hyper-masculine cells of the heavyweight champions.
We've been joined by Professor Ben Carrington, sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of the brand new book, Race, Sport, and Politics, The Sporting Black Diaspora. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. You've been watching Left to Black. Thank you, Ben, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad to be on the show.
Thank you. And take care, everyone.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.